somebody that's including things like pork and different organs and the diversity you are, and obviously you're getting a more diverse array of nutrition, but how important is that when it comes to our health and well-being?
I think diversity is very important for a number of different reasons. First, and if anybody asks me a question, my background is I've been an archaeologist my entire life, and I spent a lot of my career actually just on archaeological sites, excavating and interpreting those sites. Um, when somebody asks me a question about anything, especially nutrition, my knee-jerk reaction right away, my first thing I do is go back to what I understand about the archaeological record to start to answer it. So I'm going to do that here. So the first thing I would say is, in every case I can think about, every archaeological site had almost every archaeological site I've ever either learned about, excavated myself, interpreted, whatever, has a large diversity of plants and animals in it. Remnants of that being a part of the diet. And in some cases, so not only can we find these things on the site themselves, and there's other things we can do. We can look at dental plaque on ancient teeth and see what they were eating. Sometimes we can look at stomach content. Sometimes there's things we can do to look actually in the matrix of the bone, and we can get some general ideas. But diversity seems to be something that has been around for a very long time. Now, there are some people in the carnivore world that will suggest that we are obligate carnivores, and that there are periods of time where we're only eating meat. I do believe animals, not meat. I do believe that the most nutrient dense, bioavailable, safest form of nutrition comes from the animal world, 100%. But the reality is, in almost all cases throughout time, we've been eating a combination of animals and plants. And some of that is dependent on a number of different things. Some of it was the climate at the time, what kind of access to resources that people have. There's a lot of different things, and those ratios of things change over time. But diversity seems to be there in all of those cases. Now, I think you had Mary Ruddock on the show. Mary Ruddock is truly, I think she's one of the smartest people in the health and nutrition space right now. I mean, she is brilliant, and on top of that, one of the kindest people I've ever met in my life. I think she's amazing. My wife and I have done a lot of similar sorts of research that she's done, and we've lived and worked with a lot of indigenous and traditional groups all over the world. One of the things that we found doing that is there's still a lot of diversity even now in these extant traditional societies that we've spent time in. Nowhere near as much diversity as we see in our diets today at the grocery store, but that they're getting their resources from different places, and a lot of that is dependent on the season that they're in. So from an archaeological and ethnographic viewpoint, I think diversity is very important. The other thing that is, I think, to me, incredibly important when I think about the power of diversity is that I don't care how smart we think we are about our diets, how much information we have, how much scientists and nutritionists have figured out whatever they figured out. We're scratching the surface on understanding all the nuances of human nutrition. Scratching the surface. And for as confident as we are right now in our knowledge, we were that confident 10 years ago, we were that confident 100 years ago, we were that confident 150 years ago, and we've seen where a lot of that has got us. I think putting all of our eggs into one basket, and I love beef. I love it. It is one of my favorite meats. I love everything about it. Putting all of our eggs into one basket is a dangerous thing to do. Because the reality is we've got something wrong. I mean, no matter how smart we are, we've got something wrong. And there's safety in diversity. I mean, if you're it's one of the reasons why maize was such an issue for the people that suffered from pellagra, because that's all they were eating. Not only were they not processing it properly, but they would have, if their diets were more diverse than just maize. And many of them didn't have a choice because they didn't have access to other resources. But if they had niacin coming into their bodies from something other than nixtamalized maize, they would have been fine, right? So I think diversity is incredibly important. The other thing that is, powerful. And we were talking about earlier about not wanting to overwhelm anyone with all of these things. We should do this, and we should do this, and we should do this. I'm going to tell a very quick story, but powerful story. So a friend of mine, his name is Cian Foley. He lives in Ireland. He wrote a book called Don't Eat for Winter is the name of his book. And the quick story about Cian Foley is years ago, he was in his late 30s. He was unhealthy. He was overweight. And he lives near Waterford in Ireland. And it was middle winter. It was December. And he was eating an apple. He was looking out of his kitchen window. He had an apple tree in his yard, and he was eating an apple. And as he's eating his apple in December, he looks out at his tree, and he's like, man, there's no apples on that tree. Like, it's strange that I'm eating this apple, and I have no apples on my tree. And then he's like, hell, there's not even any leaves on the tree. Like, something's weird about this. And he started to process the importance of seasonality. He's like, look, I am only going to eat what's in season in my area, and that's the only change I'm going to make in my diet. And he transformed his health. He is now a multi-year global kettlebell champion. He's won numerous bodybuilding, drug-free bodybuilding awards. His health is amazing. But there's two key takeaways here. One is the biggest change he made in his diet was just eating seasonally. And his book, Don't Eat for Winter, is focused on this. And what he says in this, and his thesis, and he's right, is that most of the natural resources that are available to animals in the late summer and into the fall are very high carbohydrate resources. And the interaction between that and the animals that eat it is that it puts on fat so that they can so they can survive the winter. And then if you get to the resources that are available in the spring and in the early summer, these are much lower carbohydrate resources, and then the weight falls off. So that's pretty cool. So the role of seasonality is great. And that means if you're eating truly seasonally, you have already incorporated a good bit of diversity in your diet because you only have access to certain things during the year. This is unrelated, but I think very important. The other thing that's really cool is, and I've had this mindset too, when I spoke to him about this, one of the things he said is, he's like, the other problem is we have that humans are supposed to have a certain, ideal body fat percentage and keep that throughout the entire year. So animals don't do that. Like, if you look at a deer, like, a deer gets, puts on weight end of the summer, into the fall, and then the winter comes and they're living off some of its own resources and it gets leaner and leaner and leaner. If you shot a deer in October, or if you shot it, it'd be dead. If you saw a deer in October and saw that same deer in like February, it would have a completely different body fat percentage because of the cycle of the year. He's like, humans aren't supposed to be at 6% body fat the entire year. That nothing about that is natural, right? Humans are supposed to fluctuate throughout the year as well. And that's exactly, he says that's what he does. His body fat goes up in the fall. And then in the winter, it starts to go down, and then he's leaner in the spring, going into the spring. I think it's pretty interesting to consider.
And where that becomes really interesting is when we look at where different people are located. I'm here in Ontario, and we have a cold, long winter, not very many plants around, versus somebody around the equator that has less seasonality and more access to fruits and higher carbohydrate foods. So I guess that would mean, taking what you said and extrapolating it out, somebody like me would be primarily meat focused in the winter. And then when berries and things like that are growing locally in the summer, that would allow for the diversity.
It would. This is where things get a little bit complicated and nuanced, but they're worthy of thinking about. Eating locally and seasonally are incredibly important and powerful for a lot of reasons. Some of that is nutrition. Some of that is just making sure you're helping the economic engine of your local food producers, right? Connecting with them. There's a lot of wonderful things about it, right? If we think from a species level, though, and it forces us to have that diversity, and that seasonality helps keep in check one of the few limiting mechanisms that we still have in our diets today. So when I say limiting mechanisms, I wrote a blog post about this 2 weeks ago. There were certain things, just checks that were naturally there in the way that we interacted with the world that kept certain issues from coming up in our diets. So a great example are, are oxalates. And oxalates, for all the work, I've spent now about 22 years of my life researching different ways of indigenous, traditional, ancestral ways of processing plants to detoxify them and make them safe for human consumption. It's a big focus of mine. I have never found a way to detoxify the oxalates in plants and have them not be an issue. And we can dive into that a little bit later. But I just bring that up because, we have this huge oxalate issue today in our diets. And one of the reasons it's an issue in our diets today is because some of the limiting mechanisms that were naturally in place before that kept high oxalate plants at a certain level in our diet are now gone. So something like spinach, if you ate spinach, there's nothing inherently bad about spinach if you ate spinach for the 2 weeks out of the year that it grew in your area. But now we've called it a health food and made it available 365 days in the grocery store. And I know people that are making a spinach shake in the morning and then eating a spinach salad for lunch every single day. You would have never been able to do that in the past. And on top of that, they're on a keto diet, and they're eating massive amounts of almond flour, and maybe they don't like the idea of drinking another animal's milk, so they're drinking almond milk. And now all of a sudden, we've literally created this incredibly dangerous problem in somebody's diet that if you had to go out and find the almond trees, harvest the almonds, hold the almonds, shell the almonds, pick the almonds out of it, you would have never been able to consume that many almonds. But now you can have shelled almonds at Costco for $10 a bag, and somebody's telling you that's a health food, and all of a sudden we have all these issues. So eating seasonally helps keep in check some of those issues. So if you do happen to consume something that maybe isn't the best thing over a long term to consume, you're not consuming it over the long term because you only have access to it for 3 weeks or 4 weeks or whatever it happens to be.
I love that point. And I've talked about that too with things like almonds, where sometimes you don't even realize it and you think you're making better choices by getting, say, like almond milk in your latte and then having a paleo, keto, something that's, all natural, quote unquote, dessert. And then you're having a handful of almonds as a snack. And just imagine over time, and in this case, oxalates we're talking about, but the amount of toxins that are bombarding your body when you think you're doing a healthy thing, and not to mention the limited nutrients because your diet is so much less diverse. If you're basing, say, almonds as, and again, your flour, and it goes on and on. And then you mentioned the fact that you can go to Costco and spend $10 on a bag. Like it's easy to get and it's economical, and everything is compounding to make the current situation we're in, where people are just sick and confused.
And this becomes even worse, a larger issue, the more disconnected we are from our food, right? So I love this example. So years ago, we're on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, so it takes a little over an hour to get to Washington, D.C. from where I live. And when I was teaching here at Washington College, I would often take students over to the Smithsonian for different events and different exhibits. And there was an exhibit years ago here. I forget exactly the name of the exhibit, but the entire exhibit was focused on the archaeology of the Chesapeake Bay region. Some of it was prehistoric, but most of it was historic. And I remember there was this big plexiglass case, and in the case were the remains of two females, one of similar ages, both women, obviously, and one was a slave and one was that slave's owner, right next to one another. And one of the questions that it posed was, it said, okay, which one's which? And if you looked at it, most people guessed it wrong, because one of the bones, one of the skeletons, the bones were robust. All the teeth were in the head. There were no cavities. There was no sign of disease. And then the other one was frail, and the bones were riddled with disease. Teeth were falling out of their head. You would have said, oh, well, that diseased one was the slave, and it wasn't. And what was crazy, and this isn't to suggest anything was good about slavery whatsoever, but in this particular case, the point was that this was a time when only the rich people could afford sugar. And the one that consumed the sugar in their diet was the slave owner, and she paid the price for it. And no matter how bad the slave diet was, the diet that contained that much sugar was worse. And I think that's really, really powerful. And the limiting mechanism there was the cost of sugar. But now, cost of, and we can think about it from the term of cost of carbohydrates. I mean, we have subsidized so much of the wrong thing in this country that price isn't even a limiting mechanism for some of these things that we couldn't have afforded before. Almonds are a great example. Not that almonds are subsidized, but I couldn't afford we never had shelled nuts in our house. Like we couldn't, in 1978, there was no way that we could have afforded shelled nuts from the grocery store. Like that was a luxury that you maybe got some slivered almonds, like a little ounce of it to put in. It didn't happen. So the more that, so many people, now we're consumers that are not, we don't know what it takes to shell a nut anymore. How much, we have nothing, we have no basis to understand how much of that really should be in our diet because we're that far disconnected from it. And there's power in controlling that information. There's power in all of those things. And we need to get that power back.
And another layer to the problem too is that people think when they're eating almonds, it's a health food. And the dietitian will tell them it's a health food, so on and so forth. And then they're only getting part of the story. They're not learning that, okay, it can be healthy if you're eating a certain amount and you're processing it a certain way. Arguably, almonds is a bad example of the oxalates. We can't get those out. It doesn't sound like.
But there's things we can do to almonds to make it better. Not the oxalates, but other issues better for sure.
If you enjoyed that clip, you're going to want to head over here and catch a full episode. I'll see you over there.
We are literally the only species on the planet that hires somebody else to tell us what to eat. And we are the sickest we've ever been, despite that, or probably as a result of that. If you are carnivore, if you are keto, if you are vegan, if you are vegetarian...